One of the things about the war that I think we've all noted and probably got angry about, one of the many things, is that in this country, there's been huge efforts by the establishment to kind of stamp out any serious discussion about causes and contexts, about what took us to this place. I think this is something that we see in every war situation. We've seen it before, but it really has reached hysterical levels this time round. We're expected to understand this war, if you follow the mainstream, as a kind of completely isolated event, in very often in moral terms. It's a war, or very simplistic terms, a war between authoritarianism and democracy. I heard it this morning on the radio, basically between evil and depravity on the one hand and Western civilization on the other. The problem is basically Putin and his immediate cohorts are either mad, or maybe he's Hitler, or perhaps both. And that's about as far as we get when it comes to any serious attempt at explanation in the mainstream. The war's been precipitated by Putin and the Russian ruling class. It's mounted, he and it has mounted a really full-scale invasion of the country, and it's causing devastation and misery on an absolutely horrendous scale. I find the kind of the feeling you get when these things happen, it reminds me of the feeling that I got at the beginning of the Afghanistan invasion, Iraq, the other wars we've been experienced in the last couple of decades. And the broadcasts from Mariupol and from other cities under siege really are, they're heartbreaking, they're terrifying. It's a bad experience even for us here. The situation is obviously desperate. I mean, 2 million refugees in a matter of 12 days or 13 days is absolutely a shocking testimony to just how traumatic it has been for the people in Ukraine. And clearly our first and immediate response has to be to send solidarity and support to the Ukrainian people, and to demand an end to the invasion and for the withdrawal of Russian troops. If we are, though, if we want to be able to respond seriously, as Alia said, seriously and effectively to these terrible events, and try to actually figure out a way to put an end to the regular kind of series, the cycle of wars and international crises that have accelerated over the last 2 or 3 decades, we have to be able to understand why they're happening. We have to be able to analyze the underlying drivers. We have to look at what is the context and what is the history. And in particular, in this case, I'm going to be arguing tonight that the key to understanding, the framework in which we have to understand this war, is that it is essentially the product of competition and conflict between rival capitalist and imperialist powers. And the danger is that if we don't have this understanding, not just that we're completely disorientated, which would be which is the case in my opinion, and that we are reduced to these kind of banal ideas about this is like a leader turned irrational, or it's some kind of expression of evil. But also, if we don't have it, the danger is that our sense of solidarity with the Ukrainian people and our support for their struggle against the invasion can lead people into backing our government's warmongering response. It can lead us to supporting sending more Western troops into the region. It can lead us into supporting sanctions which escalate the situation, or even no-fly zones, which would involve confrontation between NATO fighters and Russian fighter planes, immediately leading to a European war, something that is unbelievably being advocated regularly by journalists, by some people claiming to be on the left, and today, as far as I understand it, by Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland. So, you know, those are all outcomes that people who are genuinely solidarizing with the people of Ukraine can be drawn into if we don't have a proper understanding, if we don't have a proper framework on which we can explain what's happening here. And the first point I want to make, really, when it comes to the analysis, is that whatever Keir Starmer or anyone else says, you simply cannot understand the current situation without taking into account the massive expansion of NATO in Eastern Europe over the last 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. 14 new states have joined NATO in several waves since then, taking NATO troops from a position where they were perhaps 1,000 kilometers from the Russian border to where now they are actually in certain places on the Russian borders themselves. And you don't have to be on the left, or you don't have to even be anti-war to recognize that this eastward expansion, and in particular, actually, the discussions about Ukraine joining NATO are and have been extremely provocative for Russia's rulers. In fact, I've made a list of top-level US politicians and diplomats and advisors who have at one time or another over the last 30 years made this point explicitly. And it's quite a list. It includes former Secretary of State's Henry Kissinger, James Baker, Madeleine Albright, Robert Gates. It includes George Kennan, who was the US diplomat who was the architect of the Cold War containment strategy that was called the Truman Doctrine. He called the eastward expansion of NATO a tragic mistake. It also includes the current head of the CIA, William J. Burns, who said this when he was US ambassador of Moscow in 2008. And it's an interesting quote for a number of reasons. He said, Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. In more than 2.5 years of conversations with key Russian players, from knuckle draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin to Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine in NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests. So said the current director of the CIA, William J. Burns, to the then Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. So, you know, this idea that Keir Starmer has and other people have, that criticizing, seeing NATO's role as a component in this crisis is in some way niche, is just absurd. It is amongst wide sections of even the ruling class, the insiders in Washington. It's regarded as being, amongst most of them, a matter of common sense. This, though, in a way, this idea that many people many foreign policy experts are saying is that particularly the attempt to get Ukraine into NATO was a massive blunder, raises the question why it happened and why confrontation was allowed to take place when at least significant sections of the ruling class in the West didn't want it to happen. And I think to answer that question, which is, if you think about it, really the key question, you have to leave the terrain of the kind of official geopolitical, realpolitik and foreign policy discussions and grasp the fundamentals here and talk about things that the ruling classes normally don't talk about so openly. And what this means is recognizing that NATO is a military alliance, and it is not some benign democratic kind of institutional process. It has been carefully orchestrated. The whole expansion has been carefully orchestrated and implemented by Washington from the time of the Clinton administration in the early 90s. It's not the case that the countries have kind of acceded, joined NATO voluntarily or democratically. What happens is they're bribed, they're cajoled, they're in all sorts of different ways pressured to join. Since the Lisbon Treaty, for example, of 2007, joining NATO has become virtually a condition of membership of the European Union. To give you another example specifically about Ukraine, Ukraine has received around $5 billion in money for democracy promotion, so-called, by US aid since 1991, most of it before 2013, 2014. The EU has given Ukraine $1 billion for similar reasons between 2004 2013. the US has been deeply involved in the whole process of trying to lure Ukraine into the Western security zone, into the Western alliance in other ways. They manipulated, the US manipulated and tried to influence the Maidan protests in 2013, 2014, the protests that removed the pro-Russian president Yanukovych and kind of switched Ukraine onto an openly pro-Western stance. And if anyone questions that statement, there really is no room for argument, because I don't know if you remember, but there was a phone call that was made by Victoria Nuland, who was the Secretary of State for the region, the US Secretary of State to the region, who was making a phone call to the US ambassador in Ukraine at the time, discussing, after the end of the Maidan protests, who should and who should not be in the Ukrainian government. And this was broadcast, absolutely, it was broadcast on the BBC, it was broadcast across the world. It's one of those documents, and there's a number of them, that's been conveniently forgotten and suppressed in the current discussions. So really what we're talking about is the NATO expansion is part of the US and Western drive to control a whole section of as much as possible of Eastern Europe, and to gain control, to gain the markets, to gain control of production, to gain control of minerals and oil and so on and so forth. And actually the end game doesn't end there. If you listen to the kind of more private communications amongst more hawkish elements in the US foreign policy world, the end game is, yeah, it's about extension of control through Eastern Europe, but it's also about regime change in Russia itself. There's a guy called Carl Gresham, who's one of the leading figures in what is laughingly named the National Endowment for Democracy, a US kind of think tank stroke advisory body, who commented back in 2013, 2014 on the Maidan events. He said, Ukraine is itself the biggest prize, but the protests in Maidan, were also a chance to put Putin on the losing end, not just in the near abroad, but in Russia itself. So what we're talking about is NATO as a force to try and control the region, to try and bring the region under Western and particularly under US hegemony. And that's really the driver here. It's not some accident that the thing has pushed further and further eastward, as I'll go on to explain in a little while. And all this is simply the most recent expression of a struggle for economic and military control over Europe that's been going on for decades. Towards the end of the Second World War, the victorious leaders of the Allied side met a number of times, but they met famously twice, Yalta and Potsdam conferences, and literally carved up Europe between them. The Soviet Union had, for decades before that, been involved in military competition with the Western powers, mainly in Europe, but also that competition had implications elsewhere. And it was actually this military competition which drove the development of the ruthless and repressive state capitalism that the Stalinist bureaucracy imposed on the Soviet Union beginning in the later 1920s. And I mean, Stalin was actually, again, if you read some of what he said about it, he was quite explicit about the whole nature of what he called socialism in one country, but was really an attempt to create in the USSR a military and therefore economic competitor with the Western powers. He said the aim of the super exploitation that this involved was to catch up and to overtake the West. And later he talked about matching the US missile for missile. And the countries that Stalin occupied after World War II were physically stripped of much of their industry. They were forced to join the Warsaw Pact. They were also forced to join what was called Comecon, which was the kind of economic alliance that was driven by the USSR. And they were forced to deal economically only with the USSR on savagely unfavorable terms. And of course, as people know, any opposition to this process, whether it was in East Germany, whether it was in Hungary, whether it was in Czechoslovakia, and Poland later, was viciously crushed by the very often by the Russian armies coming into the country. So that was the development from the point of view of the Russians before the collapse of the Soviet Union. On the Western side, NATO was set up, in the words of one of its founders, Lord Ismay, who's a British general, with the aim of, as he put it, keeping Russia out, the US in, and Germany down. And the resulting Cold War between these two sides kind of dominated politics and through the whole period. And it actually involved, funnily enough, hot wars in much of the global south, in a whole number of places in the global south, where either proxies or direct forces from Russia came into contact with forces backed by the US, and in various places, including, of course, Korea and Vietnam, direct US and many others, direct US military intervention. That happened in the global south. In the kind of Eurasian and European core, it was a war really that was conducted at the level, more than anything, of the arms race. And the arms race was obviously about matching or trying to threaten the other country, the other side militarily, but it was also ultimately an expression of economic power, because the more, as the technology developed in the period of the Cold War in the 1950s and 1960s, it became more and more sophisticated and more high tech. The amount of money that had to be pumped in order to match the enemy became absolutely enormous. And in the 1980s, the president of the United States in the early 1980s, Ronald Reagan, was explicit about the fact that increasing arms spending, raising the technological bar, particularly developing what was called the Star Wars project at the time, was a mechanism more than anything for breaking the Russian economy. And that's actually what happened. And this was a policy that was ultimately successful. In 1991, it ended in a situation where in 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US and the Western powers were really in the ascendant, and the Russian ruling class was massively on the defensive. Was essentially beaten. There was a very volatile and turbulent situation, as people know. Suddenly, huge areas of the globe that had long been closed to US business, to US corporations, were suddenly opened up. And amongst other things, this area, as we know, included vital oil and gas producing areas. On the Western side, there were different responses to this. At the time, the Secretary of State, the Foreign Minister in the US, James Baker, was in favor of trying to hold the Soviet Union together, trying to establish relatively stable relations with Russia. And it was at this point that the promises were made to the Soviet leaders. There would be no movement eastwards, that NATO wouldn't bring other countries on board, that essentially the status quo would remain. Something that, again, has been suppressed or repressed or denied even. Timothy Garton-Ash, the liberal warmonger, was on the radio a couple of days ago saying those agreements never happened, they were never made, which is absolute nonsense. Under Clinton, when Clinton took office in the US, the line began to change, and feelers were put out to Eastern European countries to join sort of interim bodies on the way to becoming part of NATO, so they could transition into NATO. And actually what happened over the next years was a gradual adoption of a more and more hawkish line by the US foreign policy elite. And this hawkish line was really a product of their assessment of the post-Cold War situation. On the one hand, the US was militarily massively superior to anyone else in the whole of on the whole global scene. American arms equaled the combined arms of the 10 countries underneath it on the league table. On the other hand, it was being more and more challenged. It was beginning to be more and more challenged economically by regional powers, and specifically and most importantly by China. And in these circumstances, where there was a kind of anxiety about its economic position in the world, but there was massive military superiority, the military option was more and more attractive as a way of ensuring US supremacy. So you had the situation by the end of the 90s, the war in NATO organized the war, conducted the war to strip Kosovo away from the former Yugoslavia, a war that happened in Europe, again, another thing that's been forgotten by most of the commentators, a brutal war that involved the devastation of Belgrade. That was followed by the Afghan intervention, then Iraq, then Syria, then Libya. And I mean, you know, the idea that is currently being peddled by the Labour leadership, amongst others, that NATO is a defensive alliance, really does rely on kind of unbelievable levels of enforced amnesia about all of these events, which are recent, which have been high profile, and which everyone who is around in those years remembers very, very clearly. So, weakened economically and militarily, the response of the Russian ruling class after the collapse of the Cold War was kind of equivocal. It wanted, on the one hand, to be able to fight its own brutal repressive wars, which it did in Chechnya in 1999 and later in Georgia. At the same time, there was some effort on the part of the Russian rulers to draw close and to try and find a place within the Western security architecture, which was something that was blocked, which was something that was completely stymied by successive US administrations. I think that the war in Syria, probably in 2013 onwards, and particularly by 2015, was a bit of a turning point, because here you had a situation where the West was attacking Russia's key ally in the Middle East, and you had this very frightening situation where Russian and US planes were flying over the same airspace on opposite sides of a war, and I think this kind of crystallized the sense that really amongst the Russian elites, there wasn't going to be any kind of accommodation. There wasn't going to be any way in. There wasn't going to be even a kind of, broad compromise situation. And I think that was one of the moments at which the Russian ruling class realized that a different tack had to be taken. And it coincided with the Maidan events in Ukraine that I've talked about. So this brings us back really to the present. And I think that Russia's current posture has been shaped by the things I've talked about, and they can be summed up in three general points. First, I think it's a reaction to the West's increasingly aggressive and hostile foreign policy, both in Eastern Europe and the wider world. Secondly, and there's a certain paradox about this, but I think it's still true, there's little doubt that Putin has been, I believe, influenced by a perception of a certain weakness on the US's part in the last few years, in particular the humiliation for NATO and for the Western powers that was the pullout from Afghanistan last year. But all of the Middle East wars haven't gone well for the West. And thirdly and finally, and connected actually, is the rise of China and Russia's fast developing alliance with China. As people are probably aware, China will be the world's biggest economy within 10, 15 years. And though its imperial project is, like any emerging world power, tends to be expressed more in economic than military terms, nevertheless, it is rapidly building up its armed forces. It's way behind the US, but it's the second military power in the world by a long chalk. And it has the most Navy ships in the world, and it also has the world's biggest standing army. And Russia and China have actually conducted a whole series of joint exercises in the last couple of years, and they've been accelerating, involving tens of thousands of troops, including mock sieges of islands, patrols by long-range bombers over the East China Sea and the Sea of Japan. And in February this year, they actually signed a 30-year gas deal involving a massive new pipeline. So when China and Russia issued a joint communique at the beginning of February this year, which announced a kind of new era of relations and announced a new global order, this was something that had been building for a while. And interestingly, it challenged, the document challenged NATO's role as being the only security umbrella. And it also endorsed the respective territorial ambitions of the countries in Ukraine and Taiwan. So I think to sort of come to a close, I think that what we're witnessing really is long-term underlying tendencies and competitions erupting into game-changing events in the here and now. And the increasingly multipolar world that many have said, even on the left, would be a safer world and would be involve, cooperation and collaboration against the great powers, has revealed itself as being something very different, a dangerous world of growing competition, growing power struggles between nuclear-armed imperialisms, which is, it's a very frightening situation. And I just want to really draw my remarks to a close by just suggesting a few things that may be the outcomes of the situation and relatively short-term outcomes of the situation. First, I think undoubtedly we're already seeing a big increase in militarization in Europe. Countries across the continent are rushing through arms spending increases, including Germany, which is nearly doubling its arms spending, which, if anyone who knows about the history of Germany since the Second World War, it's a historic shift. And of course, other countries are following suit, including, if they get away with it, the Tory government in Britain. Second, and connected, this will contribute to sharply increased tensions between NATO and Russia. Since the invasion of Ukraine, I think 22,000 additional NATO troops have been moved into Eastern Europe. 20 countries across Europe are supplying Ukraine with weapons, most of them in NATO. And so that's, the situation already tense is being massively inflamed. China, I think, will try and enhance its position globally by being a mediator to some extent, but there is no doubt that this war will deepen the already ramping up Cold War that people have talked about with China itself, which is in a sense the defining global development of the last couple of decades. And obviously the chances of a nuclear confrontation in those circumstances between big powers is greater than it has ever been, well, certainly than it has been for decades. I think in terms of NATO's fortunes, there have been short-term gains, but I think NATO may well come out of this weakened. Certainly it's an open question. One of the things about the situation is they've talked a good fight, but actually, what have they done apart from ramping up and warmongering and inflaming the situation? Let's see what happens. That could change. I hope it doesn't. And we have to campaign against it changing. It looks as if they've ruled out any kind of military response, at least for the time being. And one notable feature of the situation, by the way, is that 40 countries in the global south, including the leading economies of Brazil, India, South Africa, abstained on the UN votes condemning Russia. And this reflects, a shifting balance of power in the world, I believe. And very finally, there's one other outcome that I think, or consequence that mustn't be forgotten, and this is the absolute economic and potential social chaos, as well as the misery and suffering that can be generated by this war and by sanctions. I mean, the US has announced today it's going to stop buying gas supplies, oil supplies from Russia. Europe gets 40% of its gas and 20% of its oil from Russia. If those supplies break down, that is absolute carnage in a situation where, as everyone knows, we're already facing economic dislocation and a massive cost of living crisis. This will only be increased. This will only be massively intensified by the war. And, you know, I think this leads to the point that there is already very widespread opposition to this war. We've seen the incredibly impressive and inspiring demonstrations in Russia, which are continuing as far as we can tell, despite the threats of repression from the ruling class there, from Putin. We've seen protests in many, many other places of a mixed complexion, but nevertheless very often expressing, I think, a widespread popular horror at what is going on. And in these circumstances, you know, I think there is every possibility of building a mass popular movement around the world. And this has to be the hope. This has to be the hope in a world of, you know, of increasing barbarity, in a world where these imperialist countries are prepared to create the risk of absolutely catastrophic events. What's happening in Russia, what's happening in the streets of other places across Europe and around the world has to be the thing that we need to harness to try and stop this turning into something even more catastrophic. And I think that we have to recognize that that can only be achieved if there's a widespread understanding of what kind of war this is, because it's crucial that the anti-war sentiment is not instrumentalized into essentially support for Western ruling classes in this country. It's crucial that the movement understands the situation as being one between hostile camps, between hostile imperialisms. And it's also crucial that both we in the West and the movement in Russia see opposition to our own warmongers, which is in many ways the same point, but see opposition to our own warmongers, to our own government, to the people promoting militarism at home, as being absolutely at the heart of what we're doing when we take to the streets to protest. Thanks very much.